The courtroom was packed, the air thick with the anticipation of a routine civil dispute. Spectators filled the benches, while legal professionals flipped through papers, preparing for another day in the seemingly endless cycle of legal proceedings. At the front of the room sat Judge Harold Whitmore, a man whose face was etched with the weight of decades spent in the justice system, a man whose reputation preceded him, a man known not just for his sharp legal mind, but for his unmistakable bias. Judge Whitmore was a figure of authority, his gray hair combed neatly and his dark suit perfectly tailored. He had a commanding presence in the courtroom, one that was rarely questioned, not by the attorneys, the litigants, or the press. His rulings, while often swift and decisive, had long been the subject of whispered conversations and sideways glances. Known for his old-school methods and unspoken prejudices, he favored certain individuals over others, a practice that was both well-documented and rarely challenged. The systemic flaws were clear, yet no one dared to speak up. The courtroom was his kingdom, and what he said went. The case at hand seemed minor, a simple civil infraction over a contractual disagreement that had somehow spiraled into a courtroom battle. The defendant, Malcolm Carter, stood tall before the bench. He was sharply dressed in a tailored suit, his appearance sharp and immaculate. Yet the cold eyes of Judge Whitmore scanned him with suspicion, as if he were guilty of something far more severe. There was no overt animosity in the judge's words, but the undercurrent was clear. Malcolm, a well-spoken, self-assured black man in his early 30s, had committed the cardinal sin of looking too confident in a space that wasn't often kind to people like him. Judge Whitmore barely acknowledged him as he began the proceedings, his eyes never leaving the pages of paperwork in front of him. "Mr. Carter," he began, his voice dripping with condescension, "I've read your case. It's really quite simple. You've apparently failed to understand basic contractual obligations, and now you want to waste this court's time with excuses." Malcolm took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure despite the judge's tone. He had prepared for this. He had reviewed the details of the case thoroughly, but the reality of being in the presence of such obvious bias was a heavy burden to bear. He started to speak, attempting to explain the misunderstanding that had led to the dispute, but Judge Whitmore didn't give him a chance. "Let me stop you right there, Mr. Carter," the judge interrupted, holding up a hand. "I've heard this story many times before. People like you don't quite grasp the nuances of the law. It's clear to me that this was all just an oversight on your part, and frankly, I don't have the patience to listen to more excuses." Malcolm's brow furrowed, but he bit his tongue, his professionalism holding him back. He knew the judge's reputation, knew that attempting to argue would only lead to further dismissiveness. The courtroom around them buzzed with a quiet tension, some onlookers exchanging knowing glances. Malcolm was no stranger to discrimination. He had dealt with it his entire life, but it still stung, especially coming from someone in such a position of power. As the judge continued his tirade, Malcolm felt a flicker of anger deep within, but he suppressed it. He was used to people underestimating him because of his race, and now it seemed that Judge Whitmore was doing the same. The words cut deep, but Malcolm had made it this far because of his resilience. He would not let this man get the best of him. "Mr. Carter," Judge Whitmore continued, "you might want to consider the gravity of the situation. It's clear that some people just aren't cut out for the kinds of responsibilities you've taken on. If you don't understand basic legal concepts, perhaps you should leave this to the professionals." He paused, waiting for Malcolm to respond. Malcolm's heart raced, but he stood his ground. "Your Honor, I assure you, I understand the situation perfectly. I am a professional and have been for years." His voice was steady, and his words were firm, but the judge's dismissive gaze never wavered. Malcolm knew he had to be careful. He was here to do his job, to clear up a misunderstanding and defend his honor. But he also knew the judge wasn't likely to give him a fair chance. The odds were stacked against him, but he wasn't about to back down. What the judge didn't know, what no one in that courtroom could have imagined, was that Malcolm Carter was not just a random defendant in a civil case. He wasn't just some typical person the judge could dismiss with a few words. Malcolm Carter was a federal prosecutor, a highly successful, highly skilled attorney who had spent years working tirelessly to ensure justice for those who needed it most. His credentials were impeccable, his reputation in the legal world solid. As the judge continued to rant, Malcolm made a decision. He wasn't just going to be a passive participant in this charade. He was going to stand up, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been dismissed or underestimated. He waited for the right moment, then took a deep breath. "Your Honor," Malcolm said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room. "I've let you speak, and I've listened. But you should know something. I'm not some clueless layperson. I am a federal prosecutor, and I have served this country with distinction." The room fell silent as Malcolm's words hung in the air. For the first time that day, Judge Whitmore looked up, his face showing a flicker of surprise. The entire courtroom shifted, and people began to exchange glances. Malcolm's statement had caught everyone off guard, and the tone of the room instantly changed. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation, as Judge Whitmore finished his speech. He slammed his gavel down, issuing a ruling that many in the room found unjust. "The defendant is fined the maximum penalty allowed under the law," the judge declared with authority. "This decision is made to set an example. Law and order must prevail, and those who break the rules need to learn that there are consequences." The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, but the words were like daggers in Malcolm's chest. The judge hadn't listened to his side of the story at all. His ruling was based on assumptions, on prejudice, and it was clear that the decision had been made before the case had even started. Malcolm felt his blood begin to boil as the judge delivered a speech about justice, fairness, and the importance of holding people accountable. The words felt hollow to him, considering the judge's disregard for the truth and his refusal to see beyond his own biases. Malcolm took a deep breath, trying to control his rising frustration. He wasn't going to let the injustice stand. He stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow in the courtroom, and calmly addressed the judge. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but firm, "with all due respect, this ruling is not only unfair, it is inconsistent with the law." His words were met with shocked gasps from the audience. Malcolm wasn't known for confrontation, but today he wasn't going to let this slide. Judge Whitmore's face reddened, his brows furrowed with irritation. "What do you mean by that, Mr. Carter?" he snapped. His tone was condescending, the arrogance that had seeped into his rulings now dripping from his words. "I've seen cases like this before. You're just another person who doesn't understand the system. Perhaps you need to learn how things work around here." The judge's words were dismissive and insulting, but Malcolm didn't flinch. He wasn't about to back down. He had spent years working in the legal system, serving justice, holding people accountable, and fighting for fairness. He knew exactly how the system worked, and he knew this wasn't right. "You may be the judge here," Malcolm said, his voice calm yet laced with authority. "But you're not above the law, and neither are your personal biases." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Judge Whitmore looked at him with disbelief, his face turning a shade darker. "You'll learn how things work in this courtroom, Mr. Carter," the judge said, his voice dripping with contempt. "If you want to waste my time, I'll show you just how quickly I can make you regret it." But Malcolm wasn't intimidated. He reached slowly into his suit pocket, his movements deliberate. The room fell silent, all eyes on him. With quiet confidence, he pulled out a small badge, a federal prosecutor's badge. He held it up for everyone to see, letting the glint of metal shine under the courtroom lights. "I know exactly how the system works, Your Honor," Malcolm said, his voice steady and unwavering. "In fact, I work within it every day." The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the weight of his words settled over everyone present. The judge's jaw dropped. He stared at the badge, his face turning pale as realization dawned on him. The room buzzed with whispers as the onlookers began to grasp the enormity of the situation. The defendant, the man he had just tried to belittle and dismiss, was a federal prosecutor. He had been in the same legal system, wielding the same power, for years. Judge Whitmore took a step back, his confidence faltering as he realized the gravity of his mistake. He had misjudged Malcolm, assuming that a black man in a suit couldn't possibly be a professional of his caliber. He had let his biases cloud his judgment, and now he had been exposed. The courtroom was filled with a mixture of gasps, murmurs, and uncomfortable silence as people realized what had just unfolded. Malcolm stood tall, his posture relaxed but firm, waiting for the judge to respond. The tension in the room was palpable. He had fought for justice all his life, and now, for the first time, he was confronting the very system that had failed him, and so many others. He wasn't just fighting for his own dignity anymore. He was fighting for the dignity of everyone who had been wrongly judged, misunderstood, or discriminated against because of the color of their skin. For a moment, Judge Whitmore seemed at a loss for words, his usual arrogance replaced by uncertainty. The room waited in silence for his next move, and even the spectators, who had been so quick to judge Malcolm, now seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. Would the judge admit his mistake? Would he take responsibility for his actions, or would he double down on his bias and pride? Malcolm didn't wait for an answer. He turned to the gallery, his gaze sweeping over the courtroom. "I've spent my career defending the law, fighting for fairness, and holding people accountable," he said, his voice strong. "But no one should ever be judged by their appearance or their background. We're all equal under the law, no matter who we are." The words rang out, clear and resounding, and for a moment, the weight of the injustice seemed to dissipate, replaced by a new understanding, a shift in the atmosphere. The onlookers seemed to grasp the gravity of the moment. Even the other lawyers in the room, many of whom had been silent observers, were now looking at Malcolm with new respect. Judge Whitmore finally spoke, but his voice was shaky, his earlier confidence gone. "Mr. Carter, I apologize for my earlier remarks. I made a grave mistake." It was a small but significant admission. The crowd shifted uneasily, but no one spoke. They were witnessing a turning point, not just in the trial, but in the larger fight for justice, equality, and respect. Malcolm's eyes met the judge's, but he didn't respond right away. He wasn't here to humiliate anyone. He was here to demand change. He simply nodded, accepting the apology without need for further words. The battle had been fought, not in the courtroom, but in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed this moment. And with that, Malcolm Carter left the courtroom that day, not just as a lawyer, but as a symbol of hope for a more just future. The courtroom went silent as the weight of Malcolm's words hung in the air. The gasps from the spectators echoed like a ripple through water, and whispers began to spread through the room like wildfire. Reporters frantically scribbled in their notebooks, some pausing to take quick photos, while others exchanged nervous glances. Even the air seemed to freeze as the realization dawned on everyone present. This was no ordinary case. Judge Whitmore's face, once flushed with the arrogance of authority, drained of color. His eyes widened as he looked down at the badge in Malcolm's hand, the symbol of a man who was not just a citizen, but someone who had served the law he himself had sworn to uphold. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The defendant in front of him was no ordinary man. Malcolm Carter wasn't just a black man in a suit. He was a federal prosecutor. Malcolm stood tall, unflinching under the judge's now nervous gaze. With a composed yet commanding presence, he took a step forward, his voice steady as he spoke, but with the force of a storm behind every word. "Your Honor," he began, "I've spent years serving the law, fighting for justice, and making sure the very system you claim to represent is upheld. And now, I stand before you, not just as a man who has been wronged, but as someone who has watched the system fail so many, time and time again. Today, I'm not just asking for fairness in this courtroom, I'm demanding it." He paused, allowing his words to sink in before continuing, his tone unwavering. "You've shown bias against me, Your Honor, not based on any evidence or facts, but because of the color of my skin and my background. You've made assumptions about me, about my character, and about my ability to be treated with the same respect as others in this courtroom, and you've done so without a second thought. The very system you claim to serve has been used to punish people like me, people who come from places where justice is a luxury, not a right. And today, I am here to stand against that." As Malcolm's words echoed through the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The spectators, once silent witnesses to the injustice, began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the next move. Judge Whitmore, who had once looked so confident, now stammered, his voice faltering as he tried to regain control of the situation. I don't understand what you're—" Whitmore began, his voice shaky, trying to piece together a defense. He adjusted his glasses, his hands trembling slightly as he fumbled for the right words. "This is highly irregular. I don't believe—" Malcolm cut him off with a sharp but measured tone. "You don't believe that a man who has been wrongly judged, dismissed and mistreated for years, should stand up for himself? You don't believe that a judge should be held accountable for their actions when they violate the very principles they've sworn to uphold?" The room was still, the only sound being the soft shuffle of papers as reporters began to take even more fervent notes. The dynamic in the courtroom had shifted entirely. What was once a simple hearing was now a battleground for justice, and Malcolm had taken the reins. "I am here to say," Malcolm continued, "that this fine you've imposed on me, this punishment that has been levied without understanding, should be overturned immediately. And I am not stopping here. I will be filing a formal complaint with the Judicial Ethics Committee to address the racial bias and misconduct I've been subjected to, not only in this case, but throughout your career as a judge." As the words left his lips, the crowd was silent for a moment, processing the gravity of his statements. Malcolm's demand wasn't just for himself. It was for everyone who had been subjected to unjust treatment, for those who had suffered in silence under biased rulings, for everyone whose voice had been drowned out by prejudice. Judge Whitmore's panic became more evident. His face reddened in a mixture of embarrassment and anger as he tried to regain his composure. "You're out of line, Mr. Carter," he snapped, his voice shaky but trying to assert authority. "This is a court of law. You don't get to dictate the terms of this trial." But Malcolm wasn't done. He stepped even closer, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the judge's growing fluster. "It's not about dictating the terms, Your Honor. It's about correcting the injustices you've perpetuated. The law is supposed to be a tool of fairness, not oppression. And it's about time someone called out the hypocrisy that's been allowed to fester here." The room was thick with tension. The judge's attempt to reassert control only seemed to magnify his growing discomfort. There was no denying it now. Malcolm had shifted the conversation entirely, forcing the judge and the entire courtroom to confront the systemic issues that had plagued not just his case, but the entire legal system. "I will be filing the complaint," Malcolm said once more, his words final. "And I will not stop until the system I've dedicated my life to is held accountable." For a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath. The judge, now sweating and clearly defeated, took a long pause. The silence was heavy, pregnant with the weight of the decision that would follow. The gavel hovered in the air, but for the first time that day, the courtroom wasn't just watching a trial unfold. They were witnessing history being made. And with that, Malcolm Carter had not only fought for his own dignity, but for the dignity of everyone who had ever been wronged by a system that failed them. The courtroom, once filled with tension, now simmered with the weight of an unprecedented shift. Judge Whitmore, visibly shaken and with his authority severely undermined, sat frozen behind the bench. His fingers drummed nervously on the gavel as the room buzzed with an energy that was both palpable and heavy. The reality of the situation was settling in, not just for him, but for everyone present. The court had been rocked by a moment that was sure to change the course of his career and that of many others. Judge Whitmore's eyes darted around the room, searching for some way to salvage his dignity. But he knew, deep down, that the gravity of the moment had already passed. The moment Malcolm had stood up, confronted him with the truth, and demanded accountability, things had shifted forever. In a strained voice, Judge Whitmore cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. I hereby overturn the fine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The ruling is reversed. The case is dismissed." A murmur ran through the courtroom as spectators absorbed the unexpected turn of events. The weight of the judge's words felt almost surreal, a sharp contrast to the arrogance he had displayed earlier. The gavel came down with an almost defeated thud, sealing his decision. Malcolm stood tall, unfazed by the change in fortune. He met Judge Whitmore's gaze for just a moment, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. He had won, not just for himself, but for the many others who had silently endured under the burden of biased rulings. His victory wasn't in the overturned fine. It was in the fact that he had taken a stand against an unjust system, forcing its flaws into the light. But the consequences for Judge Whitmore were far from over. As Malcolm made his way out of the courtroom, a journalist, eager for a story that had taken on national significance, approached him with a microphone. "Mr. Carter," the journalist began, "this has been a groundbreaking moment not just for you, but for the entire legal system. Can you comment on the fact that an internal investigation has been launched against Judge Whitmore?" Malcolm paused, his thoughts settling as he faced the reporter. He nodded slowly, his calm demeanor unchanged. "This isn't just about one judge," he said, his voice steady. "This is about a system that has allowed bias to thrive unchecked for too long. It's not just about the individuals who sit on the bench. It's about the systems that perpetuate injustice." The journalist jotted down notes furiously, her eyes wide with the weight of the story she was witnessing unfold. Behind her, other reporters were buzzing with excitement, already drafting their headlines. As Malcolm walked out of the courthouse, the atmosphere outside was completely different from when he had first entered. The sunlight felt brighter, the air lighter. The media had already latched onto the story, and news outlets from across the nation began airing it as an example of the legal system finally taking accountability for its inherent flaws. The discussions were already beginning. Discussions about systemic racism in the courts, the unchecked power of judges, and the people who had suffered because of it. Later that evening, Malcolm sat alone in his office, reflecting on everything that had transpired. He stared at the case file in front of him, knowing that despite this victory, the battle against injustice was far from over. He had won today, but countless others were still out there, fighting battles similar to his, struggling to have their voices heard, their dignity restored. A knock on the door broke his reverie. His assistant entered, holding a small envelope. "This just came in for you," she said with a curious glance. Malcolm took the envelope and opened it, finding a letter of recognition from the Judicial Oversight Committee, praising his bravery in standing up for fairness and demanding accountability. It was a small but meaningful gesture, a symbol that things were changing, and his actions had sparked the beginning of that change. Malcolm placed the letter down, a sense of peace settling over him. He knew that despite the long road ahead, today had been a step in the right direction. The system had worked, just for once, in favor of justice. As the evening drew to a close, the city outside was bathed in the glow of streetlights. Malcolm sat back in his chair, the weight of the day finally lifting. For the first time in a long while, he could truly say that the fight for justice wasn't over. It had just begun.